For the last month, tensions in Ukraine have been at an all-time high. First, deadly protests and massive riots led to the ousting of the democratically elected leader Viktor Yanukovych. Then, Russian troops mobilized within the semi-autonomous region of Crimea under the auspices of protecting ethnic Russians. These developments led to a referendum in Crimea held just yesterday, where nearly 97% of voters chose to become integrated with the Russian Federation. So here to talk about what the referendum means for the people of Ukraine and where superpowers fit into the geopolitical tug of war, I'm joined by John Feffer, co-director of Foreign Policy and Focus, and Eric Draitser, founder of StopImperialism.org. Excuse me. Thanks so much for coming on, both of you. Russia is, of course, maintaining that yesterday's referendum vote in Crimea was entirely legitimate, while the U.S. and EU are refusing to recognize the outcome of the vote. Do you think that what happened yesterday was legal? Eric, I want to start with you and then have you weigh in, John.
Well, I think that legal is a complicated question because, of course, the Ukrainian constitution itself is now null and void after the violent coup that was organized by the United States, the State Department, and the various Western powers that were involved. International law becomes a murkier situation because, of course, we've had multiple precedents established already by the United States and the West in Kosovo and South Sudan and elsewhere. So I think that you could get conflicting interpretations of what is or is not legal, but what I do think is important is the legitimacy of the referendum that took place and the overwhelming support from the people of Crimea, which I would add is a majority Russian territory. It's important also to maintain a historical perspective here, I think, because Crimea has never had a democratic opportunity to voice its own opinion as to its future in 1954 when it was given by Russia over to Ukraine as a part of the
I'm going to jump in here to keep the conversation going. John, do you have anything to add?
Well, I would like to subtract things if possible. I mean, there was very little that Eric said that was actually truthful, other than the fact that a majority of people voted for joining Russia in the referendum. I wouldn't call the referendum free and fair. I wouldn't call it legitimate. It was taking place in a position of occupation. Russian troops on the ground there. Was what happened in Kiev a U.S.-sponsored coup? Of course not. It was a popular uprising. The U.S. obviously had some influence there. It had some a dog in the fight, so to speak, but it was by no means engineered by the United States and the CIA. So there are a lot of misstatements, I would say. But as we look forward, look, I mean, the referendum went forward, and we have to look at what's going to happen for Ukraine as a whole, as a country, coming out of this referendum.
I don't know if I agree about the U.S. comment, but Eric, he does bring up a good point in terms of the referendum, because there was no option to maintain Crimea's current autonomy status nor increase ties to Ukraine. Why?
Because the question of legitimacy in Crimea and in Ukraine more generally is being completely ignored here. Who is to say that the government in Ukraine at the moment has any legitimacy whatsoever? According to the Constitution and to international law, it does not. That's the reason why the Russian government is unwilling to support it or to negotiate with it. Furthermore, I would add, the notion that the United States merely has influence over what happened in Ukraine is an absolute absurdity. The Victoria Nuland phone call illustrated very clearly. They wanted Yatsenyuk to be prime minister. He is prime minister. They wanted Klitschko off to the side. He is off to the side. Everything that has happened over the course of the last 6 weeks has happened as the United States and the Western powers dictated, and to say otherwise is an absolute distortion of reality.
John, you recently wrote an article for the Huffington Post talking about that this isn't just about majority rule. This is about minority rights that are kind of being overlooked in Crimea. Can you talk about how that fits into the situation?
Sure. And I would also just like to add that regardless of the legitimacy of the government in Kiev today, that's a matter for the Ukrainians to decide, not a matter for the Russian government in Moscow to decide. As for minority questions, yes, the measure of a democracy is often how minority rights are handled. And I fear that minority rights were not handled in a respectful or democratic fashion in Crimea. Tatars basically were ignored. They decided to stay out of the referendum because they felt that there was no point in doing so. I think the ethnic Ukrainians in Crimea feel the same way. Unfortunately, what I fear will happen will be somewhat similar to the situation in Yugoslavia, in which many people will simply leave Crimea because they feel like they're no longer wanted there. Are minority rights respected in Ukraine, in Kiev? So far, I think the evidence is yes. Of course, there are problematic situations. There was a language law that was revoked, but then it was vetoed. I think that's an important thing to look at. Were the rights of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine challenged or under threat in any way? I don't think there's any real evidence that that was the case.
Eric, do you have anything to add?
Absolutely. I think that you're completely leaving out the right sector and the neo-Nazi elements who do control the streets. This is no minority. This is no part of the political process. They are in control of the security forces. They are the ones who are the avowed followers of Stepan Bandera and the Nazi collaborators. They are the ones who are the outright fascists who have said very clearly that Russians are the enemy. Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in Ukraine are to be either kicked out of the country or to be cleansed completely. These are all on the record.
Eric, I wanted to ask you really quickly. I think that we hear things in terms of black and white. It's either, it's taken over by fascists and neo-Nazis or not. And I just wanted to say how much really is true in that sense of what you're talking about. I mean, how much of the Ukrainian government really is taken over by neo-Nazi forces right now?
A significant portion, and I would add specifically, we can look at Dmitry Yarosh of Right Sector, we can look at Andrei Parubi of the Svoboda Party. They are in control of the security forces. Sure, Yatsenyuk, a liberal-friendly, Western-oriented, camera-friendly individual, is prime minister. That's fine. But those who control force on the streets, the roadblocks, the barricades, those who are engaged in the violent struggle on Maidan, they have very significant control. They're the ones in control of the National Guard. When you have an element like that that has force on the ground, they're the ones dictating policy, and those who are in positions of power are merely following along.
John, it was also reported on Sunday that Russian forces actually moved past Crimea into another village. It's since been taken back over. However, the gas plant is still under control. Why would they do this on the eve of such a tense situation? The referendum is on the eve, and also, how much of this is about natural gas?
Sure. Well, as you probably know, Crimea is heavily dependent on Ukraine and has been dependent on Ukraine for virtually everything. It's energy, it's water. If Crimea goes over to Russia, well, there was a fear that Ukraine, the government, would basically cut off all of the energy supply, all the water supply. So I think this was a preemptive move to guarantee some kind of continuity in supply. The fear, of course, is that Russia would take that a little further, not just guaranteeing that particular gas plant, but further energy supplies. I think that's what Ukraine is worried about. Of course, it's what it worries about in terms of eastern Ukraine as well. So that's a considerable problem that we have to address.
Eric, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would say that Russia has moved forward very quickly over the course of the last few years to diversify its gas delivery infrastructure. Part of that is geopolitical in nature. You've seen that the Russians have funded the Nord Stream pipeline to Germany. The South Stream pipeline is coming online next year. Part of that was to diversify away from the Ukrainian gas delivery infrastructure in order to give Russia geopolitical leverage over NATO's expansion into Ukraine. This is a 20-year standing policy from the United States. We have seen it in Georgia. We have seen it in various former Soviet republics, and I think it should be understood that part of Putin's policy and the Russian government's policy vis-a-vis their actions in Ukraine is a countermeasure against NATO expansion, and I think that international observers around the world are quite clear about that.
John, I mean, the Victoria Nolan comment earlier, I mean, it is a good point in terms of that she admitted to investing, I think, $5 billion over the last 2 decades to kind of foster the opposition movements there. Why is the U.S. so invested in a pro-U.S. Ukraine or pro-Western Ukraine?
Well, I think the United States has pushed NATO as far as it thought it could to the doorstep of Russia. It has been very interested in stabilizing Ukraine and in the Western camp, so to speak. The EU, of course, has been interested in ensuring that Ukraine, as much as possible, is as close to EU as possible. So all of this is in play. And so diplomatically speaking, of course, the State Department has been pushing its players. Was the State Department getting its way? I don't think so. I mean, the EU brokered an agreement on February 21st that would have kept Yanukovych in power, would have pushed up the date for elections. This was something that the EU pushed down the throats of, or tried to. This was something that Radek Sikorski, the foreign minister in Poland, said, you guys better accept or else, And they didn't. They didn't take the EU offer. There was pressure from the streets.
I wanted to jump in there really quickly, Eric. We have about 30 seconds left. I wanted you to follow up. Of course, there's now sanctions being talked about, imposed on some top leaders in Ukraine and Russia. How far do you see this escalation going, and what's the best case scenario here?
Well, the best case scenario is a de-escalation of the rhetoric and a move away from these absurd sanctions because, of course, the Russians can respond economically. They can start dumping some of their U.S. dollar holdings, which is something that people are suspecting around the world is already happening. They can move towards shutting down the gas deliveries to Europe. They can move towards diversifying their gas supplies to China, which has been talked about for 2 decades.
I definitely hope for a de-escalation. You guys, diplomacy all the way. Thank you so much for both of your insight. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.